Hi everyone, I'm Fidalgo, and today we'll talk about what a scope is in JavaScript.
So in JavaScript, we have two types of scope. We have the global scope and we have the local scope. Every time you declare variables inside a function, there will be local scope, while every time you declare a variable outside a function, there will be global scope. So if we do something like var name equals Fidalgo, and then we log it, oops, this variable is on the global scope because it's not inside a function. So if we run node index.js, we'll get it. Now, on the other end, if we do function get name, and then we do or var name equals Fidalgo, and then we log it, we will get first this one, and then we get this one. But the difference between this one and this one is that this variable is local scoped to this function, while this one is on the global scope. So every time a function is executed, a new scope is created. So now if we do node index.js, we'll get this one because we didn't call this function. If we call this function, we'll get both. Variables that are declared in the global scope, like this one, can be accessed everywhere. So even if we remove this function declaration here, so when we log this variable here, it will look inside this scope and will basically say, oh, I don't have a variable named name inside this scope, so it will look up on the outer scope. So the outer scope of this function will be the global scope, which will have the name. So if we log it again, we'll get both still. So when I talk about it will look up on the outer scopes, what I basically mean is every time you execute a function, it will create a scope. So this will be the scope created by getName. When you log it, it will first look inside the scope of this function, and if it can't find it, it will go up until it gets to the global scope. So for example, if we have another function here, for example, test, and then here we log the name, and let's delete from here, and now let's save. What I mean by this is now if we execute this function has its own scope, right? So this log will look for a variable called name inside this scope. It will not find it. So then it will go to this scope. It will not find it. So then it will go to the global scope and we'll find the variable here. So let's just call this function test here. And now when we execute it, we still get this console log here.
So you can think of a scope as like a box. So you have the global scope, so this box, and then when you declare a function, in our case, getName, so will be another box inside, right? The getName scope, and then inside the getName scope, we have the test scope. So you can think of it as like boxes like this. So imagine you have the global scope, the getName scope, and the test scope. When you refer to a variable inside this box, it will first look inside this box. If it cannot find it, it will then look on the outer boxes, so on the getName box. And if it cannot find it, it will then go to the global scope.
Because each function has its own scope, you can have variables with the same name inside functions. So for example, this here is the global scope. This here is the getName function scope, and this here is the test function scope, right? So here we can say const name equals test, and then here we can say const name equals another test, and here let's change this to const. We have the name equals Fidalgo. Let's delete this, and now what will happen, let me just save. What will happen here is basically when we execute this function getName, this scope will be created, then it will declare this variable. Then when we execute this function this function will try to log a function called name, and basically this variable will never be called. Why? Because this function has its own scope. So when we log it here, it will look first inside this scope for a function, for a variable called name, and it will find it here, so it will log another test. So let's just test it, and as you can see, it logs another test. So now if we delete the function declaration here, what do you think will happen? Exactly, basically it will first look inside this scope, it will not find a variable called name, so then it will look up on this scope and it will find a variable called name and it will log it test in this example. And as you can see, it logged test, and if we delete it from here, it will then look up here, then look up on this scope, and then go to the global scope and log Fidalgo. As I showed you, JavaScript will look into the current scope of a function when you try to use a variable, and if it cannot find it, it will go to the outer scope until it reaches the global scope. So you can always access the outer scope of the functions. So from this scope here of test, you can access this scope and the global scope in this case. But for example, if we declare a variable here called name and we say Pedro, and then we try to access inside this getName function, what do you think will happen? Exactly, it will not find this log here, will not log this name because it can't access this. So if we do, you see it logs Fidalgo, then Pedro. So basically, when we execute this getName, it will execute this log, and this log basically will look inside this function scope for the variable name. It will not find it, so then it will go to the outer scope, in this case the global scope. It will find it, log it, and then we call tests and it logs this one. So just to test, if I remove this from here and I save, when we call getName, this function here, when we try to log a name, it will first look here, will not find it, then it will look in the global scope and it will not find it. So as you can see, we got an error because this variable name doesn't exist, because we can't access the scope of this function. So there is a difference on how the scope works between constant let and the var declaration. So let's clean this up a bit. Let's for now remove this, and let's remove this. Okay, so now we have the global scope and we have this function. So as I told you, variables are function scoped, which means you can access inside this scope or any inner scope or inner function, while const and let are block scoped. And the block, it's for example an if block. So let's say if true, which means it will always enter here. So if true, execute this code. So this code, this is a block statement. So the difference here is if we say here var test equals test, and then we say const test1 equals test, and then let's say test2, and let's say let. So now if we try to log outside this scope, these three variables, so if we do test, and now we do test1 and test2, like I told you, var is function scoped, which means it will be available inside all the scope of this function. So when we try to log it, we can access it, even though it's inside a block statement, while const and let are block scoped, which means they can only be accessed inside this block. They are bound to this block. So when we try to log it here, we'll not be able to access these two variables. And let's just test it. As you can see, we got an error. So we first log test, which is the var, but when we try to log test1, it says test1 is not defined. Why? Because it's this variable and this variable, const and let declarations, are block scoped. So if we move these two logs here, now we can log them. Remember that the inner functions have the ability to access the scope of the outer functions, while from an outer function you can't access a variable declared inside
an inner function. And remember, there's something called the scope chain, which means when you refer to a variable, it will look inside the current block or function scope. And if it can't find that variable, it will keep looking up on the outer scopes until it reaches the global scope. So that was it for this video. I hope you liked it. If you liked it, give it a like and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you on the next one.